this involvement in Washington is, in my view, a perfect example of why we need to send to Washington someone who has not lived in Washington, but someone who's lived in the real streets of America.
Mitt Romney living in the real streets of America. Joining us now for the interview is the only person to have ever run a successful presidential campaign against Mitt Romney, MSNBC political analyst Steve Schmidt, who's the former senior strategist for the McCain-Palin campaign. Hi, Steve.
How are you?
I'm great. I've never been happier in my life.
You seem ebullient.
The Newt Gingrich returns thing is very exciting to liberals everywhere.
Yes.
Do you think this is a flash-in-the-pan thing and it doesn't matter, and in Florida it's all over?
George Bush in 2000 was the inevitable Republican nominee, despite the loss in New Hampshire, as a function of his strength as a candidate. In 2012, Mitt Romney, I still think, is the inevitable nominee of the party, but it's really a function of the weakness of the other candidates and their total implausibility to see them taking the oath of office or standing against President Obama in the general election on a debate stage.
So when you think about the strength of Mitt Romney as a candidate, it's purely relative strength. I feel like he's melting down a little bit and not handling the stress very well. Do you see it that way?
I think that all campaigns that go on to win survive some degree of a near-death experience, and they get tested. New Hampshire was a terrible period, obviously, for President Bush in 2000. I think it made him stronger as a candidate. John Kerry went through this in 2004. President Obama went through this in 2008 during the primary. So I think that these experiences will forge a stronger candidate, but there is no doubt this is not the type of week you want to have. A week ago, the consensus conventional wisdom among every political reporter, person who works in Republican politics was that Mitt Romney was going to win the South Carolina primary and the race was going to be effectively over.
Right.
And this has entirely changed over the course of the week. And it is hard to imagine a scenario where, 7 days ago, you could have pictured like having a worse week than the one he's had.
7 days ago, Mitt Romney won Iowa. I mean, had won Iowa. Now, I mean, he may be 1 for 3 at the end of this weekend. We thought he'd be 3 for 3. What was your campaign's in the McCain campaign's main strategy against Mitt Romney in 2008? What did you see as his biggest strength, and how did you try to neutralize it?
Well, his biggest strength was money, was organization, was resources. And if you remember the John McCain campaign in the summer of 2007, that campaign had collapsed. John McCain was flying in the middle seat on Southwest Airlines from BWI up to New Hampshire. So the entire campaign for John McCain was based on we have to win the New Hampshire primary. Patience is a undervalued strategic virtue in these campaigns. And we took advantage of the fight between Mike Huckabee and Mitt Romney in Iowa. Mike Huckabee knocked out Mitt Romney in Iowa. That really slowed his momentum in New Hampshire. John McCain was able to win in New Hampshire, and because Fred Thompson stayed in the race in South Carolina, we were able to close out the race. But it's a very different race in 2012, although Romney still has a hangover of the problems from the 2008 race. In 2008, he entered the race as the conservative candidate. He tried to position himself completely implausibly as the most conservative person in the race, and that gave birth, I think, to the inauthenticity problem that he carries forward to today. So that was a major part of the architecture of our campaign against Governor Romney. But at the end of the day, John McCain won that race because the issue of the hour was the withdrawal debate about taking our troops out of Iraq in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the surge. And John McCain, in a move you don't see very often in American politics, staked his entire campaign on an unpopular issue and said, I believe in this to the degree that I would rather lose the election than to see this country lose a war, in his view. And I think that had enormous currency in the Republican primary.
The inauthenticity problem that you say carries forward to 2012, I feel like the attacks on Mitt Romney are partly in that same vein, partly like you saw in 2008, sure. Always a flip-flopper. He's taken both sides on every issue. The perfectly lubricated weather vane was a nice phrase from the John Huntsman campaign. But is there something else that has emerged as a weakness for him, or do you think that's still sort of his Achilles heel?
If you analogize this to a football game, he's a quarterback this week who has shown a propensity to throw a lot of interceptions somewhat inexplicably. And Mitt Romney's strongest argument is the inevitability argument, that I'm the strongest candidate against President Obama. I'm the most likely candidate to win. And some of the mistakes he's making are obviously giving people pause around the notion that, in fact, he's the strongest candidate in November on the strength of who he is as opposed to the deficiencies in the other candidates.
How would you go after the inevitability thing specifically? Not just I'd be best against President Obama, but I am the one who is going to wrap this thing up, so just get out of the way.
Well, I think you have to, right now, you're going to have to absorb potentially a loss in South Carolina. Florida will become very important. Will Florida validate a Gingrich victory if that happens, or will Florida throw cold water on Gingrich momentum? I think it'll be an interesting 10 days, as we move forward to Florida, and then we essentially have a long break as we get ready for what's essentially a de facto national primary day. And I think the erratic nature of the Gingrich campaign, and I think you saw last night, it was a acting performance worthy of Meryl Streep. It was just incredible as you're watching it. But the melodrama around this, like, how will that impact the race out over the next 30 days? And I think it's an open question. But for my part, I think the notion of a Gingrich nomination is just totally implausible in the sense that he's 100% known by the American people, and he has a staggering unfavorable to favorable ratio in the wrong direction.
And can still beat Mitt Romney in South Carolina.
Perhaps.
Amazing. Steve Schmidt, MSNBC political analyst, the former senior strategist for McCain-Palin. I'm really looking forward to being on the V-shaped set with you tomorrow. It's going to be an interesting night, and I think it's going to be a long night. I think they're going to be counting pretty late tomorrow. I think so. And then we get to all watch Florida fill up with Romney bucks. It will. It's going to be an intense 10 days in Florida. Yeah, it's great. So good. Just a reminder, the coverage of the South Carolina primary here on MSNBC starts at 6 p.m. Eastern tomorrow night. Speaking of South Carolina, did you see these crowds in South Carolina today? In a week when lots of top-tier candidates could not fill a room, this is what the crowd looked like today that turned out to see apparently the most popular pseudo-politicians in the state of South Carolina. Neither of them named Mitt or Newt or Rick or the other Rick. That's coming up.